You're watching a Highwire Media podcast. There are plenty of reasons why homicide cases don't get the investigations they deserve. It may be due to a lack of resources, lack of funding, or understaffing, particularly when it comes to lower income communities. Unfortunately, it's far more common in cases where the victim is marginalized. We've talked about this multiple times on the show. Victims who might have lived with a substance abuse problem, and a sex worker, or worse, fit the mold of all three. If that's the case, the investigation is also guaranteed to get buried under the files of an overcrowded desk. But it becomes harder to turn a blind eye in cases like today's, where multiple women from the same town, in the same inner circle, all turn up dead in the same way over the course of a few years. While some cried serial killer, others wondered if these cases might have been buried under a host of excuses and bureaucratic red tape, for an even darker reason. It was May 20th, 2005. A man named Jerry Jackson was unloading his fishing gear on a bridge overlooking the Grand Maurice Canal, just outside of a small town called Jennings, Louisiana. He cracked open a can of soda, baited his hook, and was about to cast his line into the fresh water below when he spotted something floating in the water. At first he thought, is that a mannequin? He'd just seen a story on the news about someone stealing mannequins from shops around town. But it then dawned on him, mannequins shouldn't attract bugs. The lifeless figure floating in the canal was swarming with them. Jerry scrambled for his cell phone, dialing 911. 10 minutes later, he was answering questions from the police as they scooped the lifeless body out of the muddy waters. The woman couldn't have been older than 30. She was still in blue jeans and a white blouse. Her body showed little sign of injury, aside from a tiny scab on her scalp. Toxicology report later determined she had antidepressants as well as cocaine in her system. Her blood alcohol content was a staggering 0.16, 2 times over the legal limit. Authorities suspected she likely died of drowning or asphyxiation. Once they ran her fingerprints, they identified the victim, 28-year-old Caucasian woman, 5'3", 104 pounds, named Loretta Chassian. She was a mother of 2 and a Jennings native. She also happened to be a local sex worker. Prior to her death, Loretta had been battling a cocaine addiction. Her marriage of 5 years was falling apart, and it wasn't uncommon for her to disappear for days at a time to score a fix. But Loretta always found her way back home to her husband and kids. She tried to get clean, go to rehab, and get on the straight and narrow, but drugs always found a way back into her life. Loretta's husband claimed the last time he saw her was on May 15th. 5 days before she turned up dead. She had returned home after another bender, asking for some cash to buy food. She said goodbye to her 2 sons, not knowing it would be the last time she'd ever hug them. The last confirmed sighting of Loretta was on the morning of May 17th, 3 days before her body was found in the canal. She was spotted climbing into a truck at a gas station with a local pimp named Frankie Richard. Later that day, the two were seen at a hotel turned brothel called the Bordeaux Inn. Loretta allegedly used drugs there with 2 other sex workers, Buggy Brown and Nicole Guillory, names that will come up again later. After that, Loretta's trail went cold. It's important to paint a picture of what Jennings, Louisiana looked like during this time. Jennings is about 3 hours west of New Orleans, just north of the Gulf of Mexico. According to many, it's the boudin capital of the world, a place known for its Cajun sausage. Technically, Jennings lies in Jefferson Davis Parish. Parishes are essentially like religious counties established when the French and Spanish occupied the land centuries ago. In 2005, Jennings was a town of only about 10,000. It wasn't a particularly large community, but there was a significant cultural divide. North of the railroad tracks was where you'd find the upper class, lawyers, judges, and businessmen. South of the tracks was home to the working class, oil field workers, plumbers, and mechanics. Many of these residents relied on the industry in the next parish over, where towering oil and gas refineries dotted the landscape, contaminating food supplies and leaking toxins into the groundwater. But that's a whole other issue that we're not going to get into today. If you ever watched the opening credits of True Detective Season 1, allegedly inspired by this case, that's the vibe of Jennings and its surrounding areas. Gray, bleak, ominous, and foreboding. Combine that with a drug trade taking over the local slice of the I-10 freeway, Jennings starts to sound like a pretty tough place to live. And the mysterious deaths didn't stop with Loretta. On June 18th, 2005, less than a month after Jerry Jackson discovered Loretta's body floating in the murky waters, a group of boys were out catching frogs in a swamp off of Highway 102, not far from the I-10 drug route. There, they spotted something out of place, a dead body floating closer to the banks. Boys called 911. Again, the police arrived, covered the remains of another young woman. She was black, wearing jean cutoff shorts with a deep incision across her neck. Her hands were badly bruised, and her face was unrecognizable. It didn't take long for police to identify her as 30-year-old Ernestine Marie Daniels, another local sex worker who had been missing for 2 days. Loretta Ernestine had a history of substance abuse and a failed marriage. During times of clarity, she had tried to get clean by turning to God, but her problems always seemed bigger than herself. The biggest difference between the two ladies' stories were that Ernestine had faced a series of racist encounters around town. After her death, her sister Jessica recalled a disturbing interaction they had with an officer while walking home one night in 2004. An unmarked police car pulled up alongside them, and the officers began questioning them about where they were going. The interaction quickly turned hostile. The officer called her degrading names, referencing her substance abuse issues and line of work. When Jessica tried to stand up to him, he urged her to just keep walking and ignore his threats. But then, the officer made a chilling statement they would never forget. He told the sisters that if he saw them again, he would kill them. When Jessica tried to report the threats to the local police station, she claimed they laughed at her and refused to file an official report. After her body was discovered, that interaction with the officer stood out like a glaring red flag. But as unsettling as it wasn't the only concern. On the night she was last seen alive, June 16th, 2005, she had reportedly been with two clients, a man named Byron Chad Jones and his friend Lawrence Nixon. Police zeroed in on Jones and Nixon as potential suspects in her murder. Eventually, Nixon's wife gave investigators a compelling reason to arrest the men. He claimed that on the night of Ernestine's death, the two men returned to her house carrying a bulging, bloody-soaked garbage bag. They left the bag on the porch until a white vehicle arrived to pick it up. Even the couple's teenage daughter admitted that her father came home covered in blood that night. With this disturbing testimony, police arrested both men in 2006 and charged them with second-degree murder. But what happened next was baffling. Jennings Police Department didn't examine the Nixon household as a potential crime scene until 15 months after Ernestine's death. When they finally did, they claimed the scene failed to demonstrate the presence of blood, a conclusion that, unsurprisingly, came after a year and a half had passed. By that point, any evidence that might have tied the men to Ernestine's murder had long since been destroyed or cleaned up. As a result, all charges against Jones and Nixon were dropped due to a lack of evidence. By now, it was clear that something wasn't right. First, Loretta and Ernestine, two women from the same town, the same vulnerable demographic, and similar social circles, had turned up dead in suspicious circumstances. But was this simply shoddy police work, or was there something far more sinister going on, like someone protecting the killers? On March 18th, 2007, police responded to a call about another body. This time it was found in a canal just outside of Jennings. The victim was naked. Aside from a gold ring and a sock, she had a tattoo of two locking hearts on her lower right leg. Investigators identified her as 21-year-old Kristen Gary Lopez, a young Caucasian woman who had been reported missing just days earlier. Like Loretta and Ernestine, Kristen had a history of drug abuse and was known to have worked in the sex trade. And like the others, she had been part of the same social circles. Despite these similarities, her case was no closer to being solved. Her autopsy revealed no sign of major trauma, no injuries to her face, ribs, or scalp. And while her official cause of death was listed as undetermined, investigators suspected asphyxiation. Kristen was different from the other victims in one significant way. She had lived with an intellectual disability and had been abandoned by her parents, leaving her to fend for herself. By this point, the murders were forming a clear and disturbing pattern. A young woman aged 20 to 30, a history of substance abuse, connection to sex work. All knew each other and were being found dead in or near bodies of water. Mysterious deaths didn't stop with Kristen. May 2007, the body of 26-year-old Whitney Dubois turned up near some crawfish ponds along Highway 102. Location was eerily close to where Ernestine's body had been found 2 years earlier. Like Kristen, Whitney's body was found naked. He had a high blood alcohol level, a history of drug use, and had also been involved in sex work. However, there was one chilling difference in Whitney's case. Her face had been severely beaten before her death. Throughout the investigation, one name kept surfacing during witness interviews: Frankie Richard. He had already been mentioned in Loretta's case, and now he was coming up again. Who is Frankie Richard? Frankie Richard was a well-known figure in Jennings. He had a violent criminal past, a crack cocaine addiction, was a notorious pimp who frequently worked with a local woman involved in sex work. Frankie was also one of the last people to have been seen with multiple victims before they died. Frankie's name first came up in Loretta's case when he was seen with her at the Bordeaux Inn just days before her death. Witnesses later connected him to Kristen, Whitney, and other victims as well. Despite this, Frankie denied any involvement in the murders. He claimed he had nothing to gain from killing the women. After all, they worked for him and earned him money. Frankie insisted he was like a father figure to the victims, sharing similar traumas with them and trying to help them break the cycles of addiction and poverty. But Frankie's claims of being a hometown hero didn't hold up under scrutiny. He admitted to having sex with the women and being involved in drug and sex trafficking. Even so, Frankie argued that the women were targeted because they'd seen or heard something they weren't supposed to, not because of him. In May 2007, Frankie and his niece, Hannah Connor, were arrested in connection with Kristen Lopez's death. Police claim Frankie had been involved in an argument with Kristen the night she died, after she allegedly stole items from his motel room. However, within weeks, all charges against Frankie and Hannah were dropped due to a lack of evidence. Frankie maintained his innocence, even pointing out that he had been in rehab during one of the murders, giving him a solid alibi. By spring 2008, whoever was killing the women of Jefferson Davis Parish claimed their fifth victim. On May 29, 2008, 23-year-old Muggy Brown's body was discovered fully clothed in the middle of a rural road. Unlike the other victims, Muggy's body had not been found in water. Instead, it was doused in bleach. She had several incision wounds around her head and neck. Muggy's grandmother, Bessie, said she had last seen her granddaughter the Friday before her death. Muggy had stopped by to say she was going to a friend's house for dinner, but never returned. And this was unusual, as Muggy had a young son at home, rarely disappeared without a trace. Before her death, Muggy had confided in her grandmother, saying she felt something bad was going to happen, that she feared she would turn up dead next. Muggy Brown's fears were tragically realized. Her body became yet another addition to the growing list of victims, all of whom were connected in some way. Like the others, Muggy had struggled with substance abuse and was known to frequent the Bordeaux Inn. He also knew all the previous victims. Connections between these women wasn't just circumstantial. They were friends, colleagues, and part of the same tight-knit but dangerous social circle. By the end of August 2008, the killer struck again. This time, the victim was 24-year-old Crystal Shea Benoit Zeno. Crystal's body was found naked on a river embankment, but unlike the others, her remains were so decomposed that an autopsy could reveal little about her cause of death. Still, the circumstances fit the now familiar pattern. Crystal, like the others, was involved in sex work, had a history of drug abuse, and was part of the same group of women. The pattern of death continued in November 2008 with the discovery of the youngest victim yet. 17-year-old Brittany Gary was found dead along the side of a rural road. Like the others, her cause of death was believed to be asphyxiation. Brittany, too, fit the profile of the previous victims, struggled with substance abuse, had been involved in sex work, and knew several of the women who had already been killed. Adding another layer of heartbreak to Brittany's story was the fact that she was the cousin of Kristen Lopez, one of the earlier victims. Her murder brought the official victim count to 7, which finally prompted action from local law enforcement. In December 2008, after 7 murders, the Jefferson Davis Parish Sheriff's Department finally formed a multi-agency task force to investigate the deaths. Sheriff Ricky Edwards announced that the murders were believed to have been committed by a common offender. Despite this, the task force was widely criticized for being reactive rather than proactive. Families of the victims questioned why it had taken so long for law enforcement to take their loved ones as seriously. Residents of Jennings were living in fear in a small town of only 10,000 people. Having 7 women turn up dead was beyond alarming. People wondered who might be next, and speculation about a serial killer began to spread. But while some clung to this theory, others suspected there was more to the story, something darker, something bigger. Despite the formation of the task force, law enforcement was unable to prevent an 8th murder. On August 19, 2009, the body of 26-year-old Nicole Gilroy was found along the side of I-10, making her the first victim discovered outside of Jefferson Davis Parish. Nicole, like the others, knew all of the previous victims. She had a history of drug use and sex work, and she had expressed deep paranoia in the 2 weeks leading up to her death. Nicole's mother, Barbara, later revealed that Nicole had refused to plan her 27th birthday, telling her mother she wouldn't live to see it. Sadly, she was right. Her toxicology report revealed the presence of cocaine and painkillers in her system. While no trauma was detected, investigators again believed she had died from asphyxiation. With her death, the victim count, what the media was now calling the Jeff Davis 8, was complete. Creation of the task force came far too late for the 8 women. What's worse, the task force itself quickly became the focus of criticism and controversy. Families of the victims reported that investigators never reached out to them for interviews or information. Loretta Chassian's husband, Scott, echoed the question on everyone's minds. Why did it take 7 victims before law enforcement began to take these murders seriously? Looking closer at the history of the Jennings Police Department and the Jeff Davis Parish Sheriff's Office, it became clear that these agencies had a long-standing reputation for corruption and misconduct. The Jeff Davis 8 was far from the first time an investigation in the area had been mishandled, or worse, deliberately obscured. The Jennings Police Department and Jefferson Davis Sheriff's Office had been plagued by scandal for decades. Between unsolved homicides, missing evidence, and direct involvement in illegal activities, it became apparent that law enforcement in the area was not to be trusted. For example, between 1990 and 2005, there were 12 other unsolved homicides in the area, a shockingly high number for such a small community. Beyond the unsolved cases, there was troubling incidents that exposed just how compromised local law enforcement had become. In March 1990, 2 men robbed the sheriff's station, stealing back 300 pounds of confiscated marijuana. It was later revealed to be an inside job involving Chief Deputy Sheriff Frankie Richard. Yes, that Frankie Richard, the one tied to the victims. In 1993, the parish sheriff Dallas Cormier pleaded guilty to improper dealings with inmates and using public funds to purchase cars and firearms for personal use. In 2000, a Jennings police officer murdered another officer and his wife inside their home, then shot and killed the responding officer. Then, 3 years later, 8 female officers filed a sexual violence and harassment lawsuit against male officers in the department. And then, 10 years later, the evidence room at the police station was robbed again. Cash, pills, cocaine, and marijuana disappearing. This time, the suspect was former police chief Johnny Lasseter. These examples painted a grim picture of the corruption and chaos that had permeated law enforcement in Jennings. When residents began to connect the dots, many wondered whether the police were not just incompetent, but actively complicit in the murders of the Jeff Davis 8. There was one additional detail that tied all 8 victims together, a fact that had been widely discussed until much later. All the women were reportedly working as informants for the Jennings Police Department. Their role as informants typically involved providing information about the local drug trade, which was rampant in the area. Knowing this, many began to suspect that the women may have been silenced because they had seen or heard something they weren't supposed to. Could the police themselves have been involved in the murders, or at the very least covering them up? This theory gained traction in 2007 after Kristen Lopez's death. Around this time, Warren Gary, a chief investigator for the sheriff's office, purchased a truck from an incarcerated woman named Connie Seiler. Witnesses reported seeing Kristen Lopez in that same truck on the day she disappeared, and one even claimed there was blood inside it. Instead of preserving the vehicle as evidence, Warren Gary bought it for $8,700 and had it cleaned, and then resold it a few weeks later for a profit. The truck disappeared, and with it, any potential evidence related to Kristen's murder. When the incident was brought to light, no one in the sheriff's office seemed to care. Incredibly, instead of being disciplined, Warren Gary was promoted to head of the evidence room. The actions of Warren Gary were just one example of how potential evidence in the Jeff Davis 8 murders was mishandled, or worse, deliberately destroyed. This left residents and families of the victims wondering, were the police themselves involved in the murders? Were they covering up for someone else? Former Jennings police officer Jesse Ewing was one of the few within law enforcement who dared to speak out. After learning about Warren Gary's suspicious purchase and resale of the truck connected to Kristen Lopez's disappearance, Jesse began his own informal investigation. He interviewed people close to Frankie Richard and the woman who had sold the truck. They told him something shocking. The truck had been offloaded to Warren Gary, specifically to help destroy evidence tied to Kristen's death. Realizing this was bigger than he could handle on his own, Jesse handed the information over to a private investigator who then passed it on to the FBI. This seemed like the right thing to do, but instead of being praised for exposing potential corruption, Jesse was arrested. He was charged with obstruction of justice, not for any involvement in the murders, but for bypassing the chain of command by going to a private investigator instead of his superiors. Jesse's career in law enforcement ended with his firing. Meanwhile, the truck was never tracked down. The allegations against Warren Gary were swept under the rug. It became a glaring example of how the system protected its own, even at the expense of justice for the victims. While Frankie Richards' name came up repeatedly in connection to the Jeff Davis 8, no charges against him ever stuck. Over the years, Frankie maintained that he had no involvement in the murders, insisting that the women were targeted because they had seen or heard something they weren't supposed to. He even suggested that their deaths could be tied to the police or others involved in the local drug trade. It's important to note that Frankie had been working with local law enforcement as far back as the 90s. He had allegedly insisted an inside job involving stolen evidence, and rumors swirled that he had a close relationship with members of the sheriff's office. Some witnesses even claimed that Frankie had access to a key to the task force office investigating the murders, allowing him to come and go as he pleased. If true, this would raise serious questions about the objectivity of the investigation. Why was someone like Frankie, with a violent history and clear connection to the victims, being given such leeway? Frankie's criminal record is another point of concern. Multiple charges against him, including rape and even murder, have been mysteriously dropped over the years. It painted a troubling picture. Was Frankie being protected because of his involvement with law enforcement? Or was he just a convenient scapegoat for a corrupt system? The theory that the Jeff Davis 8 victims were silenced because of what they knew gained traction over time. Many of the women had been working as police informants, particularly about the local drug trade. They were likely privy to sensitive information, and it's possible that some of them witnessed crimes they weren't see. Take Muggy Brown, for example. Muggy was brought in for questioning about Ernestine's murder before she herself turned up dead. Similarly, Kristen Lopez was interrogated about Loretta's death before she went missing, and Nicole Guillory's mother, Barbara, believes her daughter may have witnessed police officers committing a crime, something Nicole knew would ultimately get her killed. These connections painted a disturbing picture. Not only were the victims being targeted, but the very people responsible for protecting them might have been involved in their deaths. By 2009, the Jeff Davis 8 case had garnered national attention. Residents of Jennings were growing increasingly vocal about the distrust of local law enforcement. Many believed the police were either complicit in the murders or actively covering for someone who was. One resident, Mary Drake, expressed the frustration felt by so many in the community. In a 2019 documentary, she said, quote, "You can go out there and find 9 or 10 people for the murder of one man in Lake Arthur in a couple weeks' time. If you can't find the murder of 8 women over a certain amount of years, what does that tell you?" It's self-explanatory. Families of the victims echoed this sentiment. They felt ignored and dismissed by the task force, which they accused of doing little more than issuing press releases. Some family members were now even contacted by investigators. It became clear that these cases had been mishandled from the start, and the families of the victims were left to fight for justice on their own. By the time the task force was formed, the Jefferson Davis Parish Sheriff's Office and the Jennings Police Department had already developed a reputation for corruption and incompetence. For decades, they had been involved in scandals ranging from theft to murder. Officers had been implicated in the drug trade they were supposed to be policing. Evidence had been stolen or destroyed, sometimes by law enforcement officers themselves. Serious charges against suspects like Frankie Richard were routinely dropped without explanation. Even when law enforcement was given evidence of potential misconduct, such as the truck tied to Kristen Lopez's death, it seemed more effort was spent covering up wrongdoing than solving the crimes. But why haven't these cases been solved? Jeff Davis' 8 murders remains officially unsolved, and the lack of resolution raises serious questions. Was the investigation derailed by incompetence, or was it deliberately sabotaged by those who have something to hide? One thing is clear, the victims were failed at every level. They were failed by a system that didn't take their lives seriously because of their circumstances. They were failed by a police force plagued by corruption, and they were failed by a community that was unable or unwilling to hold those in power accountable. Despite the task force public declarations, there has been little progress in the case since 2009. Families of the victims continue to fight for answers, but their voices are often drowned out by a system that seems determined to move on. In the years since the Jeff Davis 8 murders, some steps have been taken to reform local law enforcement. However, many residents remain skeptical. Corruption and mistrust run deep in Jennings, and for good reason. While it's possible that the murders were the work of a single serial killer, the evidence points to something far more complex. Whether it was a cover-up, a conspiracy, or simply a failure of the system, one thing is certain. Women of the Jeff Davis 8 deserve better. Their families deserve justice. The truth about what happens to them remains buried, much like the women themselves. Let me know your thoughts in the comments section below. Let me know your theories and what you think happened. As always, give us a thumbs up if you like our video. Hit that subscribe button down below. And of course, if you want to support the channel, you can buy me a coffee at buymeacoffee.com/TCNS. As always, your support helps the channel grow, upgrade our equipment, bring in new hosts, be able to pay them, and eventually take this show on the road. As always, thank you so much for watching and listening, and we will see you next time.